They turned off the lights on his dreams, so he learned to shine in the dark. The corporate tower on Lexington Avenue was never quiet, but at midnight, it became something else. A hollow giant of glass and steel, humming softly with electricity and ambition. Ethan Blackwood, billionaire CEO of Blackwood Industries, had returned unexpectedly. A deal in Tokyo collapsed, and sleep refused to come. He decided to walk through his headquarters, something he hadn't done in years. As he stepped onto the 14th floor, something caught his eye. One desk lamp was on. Strange. All departments were closed after 9 p.m. Security logs confirmed it. Ethan walked closer, irritation rising, until he saw him. A janitor, a black man in a faded blue uniform, sat at a conference table, surrounded by thick textbooks. Calculus, economics, corporate law. His hands were rough, scarred by years of labor, yet they carefully underlined paragraphs like they mattered more than sleep. The overhead lights were off. Only a small desk lamp illuminated his face. Ethan frowned. Why study in the dark? Then he noticed the power cord unplugged. The man was studying by a battery-powered lamp, because he wasn't allowed to use the building's electricity. Ethan cleared his throat, and the sound alone snapped the janitor upright, as if pulled by a wire, the man's chair scraping softly against the floor as panic flashed across his eyes, and his hands instinctively moved to close the book, as though knowledge itself were contraband. I'm sorry, sir," he said too quickly, words tumbling over each other. "I clean this floor. I'll leave right now," and he reached for his cart, already rehearsing the walk of shame he had done in his head 100 times. But Ethan didn't step aside or raise his voice. He simply studied the man in front of him, the worn gloves, the careful posture, the way his eyes flicked between authority and exit like a trapped animal calculating survival. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, calm but firm, and the question alone confused Marcus enough to answer honestly. "Marcus Reed, sir," his voice steadying despite himself. Ethan gestured with his chin toward the stack of books and loose papers spread across the desk. Pages filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, formulas, vocabulary words underlined twice. "Those don't look like casual reading," he said, not accusing, just observing, and Marcus hesitated, jaw tightening. Weighing whether honesty would cost him his job or lying would cost him his dignity, then he exhaled and spoke anyway. "I'm studying for the MBA entrance exam. I couldn't afford classes, so I teach myself. After my shift," the words felt heavier once spoken aloud, like he had just admitted to trespassing in a world not built for him. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, not in mockery but curiosity. "Why here?" Marcus swallowed, fingers curling around the edge of the desk as if grounding himself. "Because this is the only place where ambition doesn't feel like a joke," he said quietly, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make Marcus regret everything. The hum of the building settling back in, lights buzzing faintly, the distant echo of an elevator somewhere below. Then Ethan spoke again, and it was exactly what Marcus expected to hear but somehow didn't. "You're not supposed to be here after hours." Marcus nodded immediately. "I know," his voice barely above a whisper, "and you're using company space without permission," Ethan continued, and Marcus nodded again, shoulders bracing for impact. "Yes, sir." Termination loomed so clearly Marcus could almost hear the HR script already forming, but instead of delivering it, Ethan asked something else entirely. "Why the dark?" Marcus looked down, eyes lingering on the small desk lamp he had brought from home, its cord taped together in 2 places. "Security warned me last month," he said, shame creeping in despite his effort to stay composed. "Said janitors don't need lights to clean. So I brought my own," and that sentence landed with unexpected force, not dramatic, not loud, just heavy, like a truth no one had bothered to notice before. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest as he took in the absurdity of it. A man told his vision didn't matter because his role didn't. A mind working in shadows because someone decided that was where it belonged. Ethan glanced around the room, the expensive furniture, the framed mission statements on the wall about growth and opportunity and innovation, and for the first time that night, they felt dishonest. "How long have you been doing this?" Ethan asked, softer now. Marcus hesitated again, then answered, 8 months, and before he could stop himself added, "I clean slower on purpose so I can finish my reading," expecting that confession to be the final nail, but Ethan didn't react the way Marcus feared. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, the quiet authority of the gesture more disarming than anger would have been. What score are you aiming for? Ethan asked, and Marcus blinked, caught off guard. 700, he said automatically, then frowned. At least, Ethan nodded. And what happens if you get it? Marcus straightened despite himself, something like hope flickering in his voice. Then I apply scholarships, maybe night programs. I stop pretending this is all I'll ever be. The words hung there, raw and unpolished, and Ethan leaned back, studying the man not as a janitor, but as a person standing at the edge of something bigger. You know, Ethan said slowly, this building runs on people who stay late thinking about problems no one asked them to solve. Marcus looked up, unsure where this was going. Difference is, Ethan continued, they're usually paid to be here. He stood, glanced once more at the lamp, the books. The determination etched into Marcus's posture, then said, you finish your session. I'll tell security you're authorized. Marcus stared at him, convinced he'd misheard. Sir. Ethan met his eyes, unwavering. But tomorrow, we find you a better place to study. With lights, and as Ethan walked toward the door, Marcus remained frozen for a moment, the weight of years of quiet dismissal slowly lifting, realizing that for the first time someone with power hadn't asked him to disappear, they had asked him where he was going. Ethan pulled out a chair, the metal scraping softly against the polished floor, and sat without a word, the silence in the empty office thick and heavy, almost tangible, as if it were part of the test itself. And then, almost casually, he asked, what's the derivative of ln x2 plus 1? Marcus blinked once, twice, not because he didn't know, but because the situation itself was surreal. A janitor in a billionaire's office asked questions that didn't belong to him. And yet the voice was calm, steady, and somehow challenging, and Marcus's mind snapped into focus. The years of late nights spent memorizing formulas, scribbling notes in margins, teaching himself what he couldn't afford in classrooms, crystallizing instantly into a single answer, precise, correct. And without hesitation, and before Marcus could even catch his breath, Ethan leaned slightly forward, eyebrows raised. What's the difference between gross margin and operating margin? Marcus's lips moved almost automatically, words flowing with the certainty that came from repetition and study. Gross margin measures the percentage of revenue that exceeds the cost of goods sold, while operating margin accounts for all operating expenses in addition to COGS, reflecting the profitability of core operations. Ethan nodded slightly, his expression unreadable, as though he had expected a different answer, yet Marcus could feel the weight of the silence stretch out, and then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's face changed, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, lips pressing together as he considered not just the answer, but the composure, the confidence, the clarity with which it was delivered. And then came the barrage, slow at first, subtle, then relentless, 30 minutes of questions spanning finance, economics, ethics, strategy, and market failures, each one carefully chosen, precise, cutting through layers of theory and application, and Marcus answered each calmly, clearly. And correctly, reasoning through problems as if he had been born for this exact moment, connecting dots that most would miss, anticipating the follow-up questions before they were asked, challenging assumptions while remaining respectful, never faltering, never pausing to beg for mercy, each answer solidifying a reality he hadn't allowed himself to dream of, and Ethan watched, leaning back, crossing one leg over the other, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally just observing. His face an enigmatic mask that revealed nothing yet hinted at everything, until finally, with a long exhale that seemed to release decades of calculation and judgment, Ethan stood, towering, the quiet authority of his presence filling the room, and said, "You're wasting your potential." And the words struck Marcus not as criticism, but as recognition, an acknowledgement of all the late nights, all the sacrifices, all the unacknowledged hours spent building knowledge in the shadows, and Marcus smiled faintly. A mix of amusement and resignation. "Sir, potential doesn't pay rent," he said, the truth in those words raw and unyielding, the pragmatic shield he had learned to carry. Yet Ethan didn't argue, didn't scold, didn't shake his head in disapproval. He simply walked away, the echo of his steps fading slowly, leaving Marcus alone with his books, convinced that this had been a one-time interrogation, a fleeting moment of curiosity from someone who could have dismissed him with a glance. And yet, as he packed up his notes, stacking them carefully, closing the notebooks with precision, he felt a strange flutter of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, fragile yet undeniable, because in that room, under the weight of unexpected scrutiny, he had proven not just knowledge, but worth, not just capability, but the right to exist in spaces that had never invited him. And for the first time, he understood that being here was not about permission, not about luck, not about circumstance, but about recognition, and recognition, once given, could not be taken back. And as he left the office, careful to lock the small lamp back into his backpack, careful to wipe any trace of his late-night study from the desk, he walked with a lighter step than he had in months, convinced he would never be allowed back, that this would be the final chapter in a story that had no audience, only him and the books and the silent, approving judgment of someone who mattered. Yet the truth, as it always does, had a way of bending expectations, and the next morning, when he returned to the building, cautious, almost apologetic in his presence, he found the front door already unlocked, the security guard nodding with recognition rather than admonition, a note waiting for him on the floor by the elevator, and Marcus picked it up, hesitating, the paper crisp, the handwriting unfamiliar yet unmistakably Ethan's, and it simply read, "Keep the lamp. Finish your session. I'll see you after hours." And in that moment, Marcus felt the impossible possibility of a path opening, a world where ambition was no longer a silent crime committed in the shadows, but a visible, acknowledged force, and the fear that had followed him like a shadow for years. The fear that knowledge and aspiration had limits imposed by circumstance, by class, by perception, melted just slightly, and Marcus smiled, truly smiled, feeling for the first time the exhilarating, terrifying idea that he belonged somewhere he had always thought he couldn't. And as he ascended the elevator, the weight of books on his back and hope in his chest, he realized that this was only the beginning, that the test no one knew about was not a single moment, not a single question, but the ongoing, relentless proving of oneself to a world that refuses to notice until you step into the light. And Marcus was ready, for the first time in his life, to step fully into that light. 3 months later, the atmosphere at Blackwood Industries was tense, thick with anticipation and curiosity, and the morning sunlight barely penetrated the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the boardroom, the polished mahogany table reflecting the anxious expressions of executives in tailored suits, each one shuffling papers, checking devices, trying to anticipate what this emergency meeting entailed. And then Ethan entered, calm, composed, his presence commanding silence before a single word left his mouth, the room settling into a rigid attention as if gravity itself had shifted. And with a brief nod to the secretary, the doors closed, locking in the weight of expectation. And then, as the murmurs died, Ethan gestured toward Marcus, the intern phenomenon who had arrived early, dressed impeccably, tie straight, posture impeccable, hands clasped in front of him, a mixture of nerves and determination radiating subtly. But he held himself steady, because he had spent the last 3 months proving, silently and tirelessly, that every action, every suggestion, every hour of work mattered. And when Ethan spoke again, his voice was deliberate. "Marcus Reed will present the growth strategy." And all eyes shifted, some skeptical, some curious, some openly doubtful, whispers slicing through the air for a moment before the weight of Ethan's gaze silenced them. And Marcus stepped forward, heart pounding, palms slightly clammy, yet voice steady as he began outlining a vision no one in the room had anticipated, a comprehensive growth strategy that intertwined operational efficiency, market expansion, risk mitigation, and innovative product placement. Each slide, each chart, each projection meticulously prepared, drawn from the months of relentless observation, analysis, and self-education. And as he spoke, initially hesitant in tone, the clarity of his arguments, the precision of his data, and the practicality of his recommendations began to command attention. Executives leaned forward, scribbling notes, murmuring confirmations, exchanging glances, and for the first time, Marcus felt the room reacting not to his uniform, his background, or assumptions about him, but to the substance of his mind. And he continued, linking logistical optimizations to revenue projections, cost reductions to competitive advantage, highlighting inefficiencies others hadn't noticed, posing strategic partnerships that aligned with the company's long-term vision, offering ethical frameworks for expansion that preempted regulatory hurdles, his voice growing stronger, more confident, fueled by preparation and a deep understanding of both theory and practice, until finally, he concluded with a calm, steady flourish, detailing measurable outcomes, timelines, and risk assessments, the kind of presentation that could change the trajectory of a company if implemented. And silence fell. Absolute, almost reverent, a vacuum where skepticism had once lived. And then, slowly, deliberately, the first clap echoed through the room, followed by another, And another, a chain reaction that built into a rolling applause, hesitant at first, then genuine, appreciative, acknowledging not just the brilliance of the strategy, but the audacity of the man presenting it. And Ethan stood, tall, imposing, a subtle smile on his face, and held up his hand for quiet. The room falling into hushed expectancy again. "Before you vote," he said, his voice carrying weight, authority, and a subtle edge of satisfaction, "there's something you should know." And all eyes turned toward Marcus, who remained composed, hands folded calmly, the board waiting for the reveal, for the twist that explained the brilliance they had just witnessed. And Ethan gestured slowly, deliberately. "3 months ago, this man cleaned your offices." And the room collectively inhaled. Wave of shock rippling across the table, gasps punctuating the silence, the realization sinking in, some executives leaning back in disbelief, others exchanging incredulous glances, murmurs of astonishment barely restrained. And Ethan continued, voice steady, measured. "He studied by battery lamp because we need him light." And the room froze again, absorbing the weight of years of unrecognized talent compressed into a moment of revelation, the implications settling like sediment in water. Thick and undeniable, no one spoke for several beats, the hum of the air conditioning and faint tapping of pens the only sounds. And then Ethan's eyes scanned the room, sharp, commanding attention, and he said the words that would forever change the dynamic of Blackwood Industries. "Talent doesn't look like a title. Intelligence doesn't wear a suit." And greatness often enters buildings through the service door. And the room exhaled collectively, the message sinking in, the meaning undeniable, a humbling acknowledgement that had been long overdue. And the board, initially frozen in shock and disbelief, began to deliberate, nodding subtly, voices lowered in conversation, discussing not just the strategy, but the man who had delivered it, the courage, the initiative, the intellect that had thrived despite circumstances designed to limit him. And after only a brief discussion, the vote was unanimous. The decision instant: Marcus Reed would be promoted permanently. No probation, no internship title, full acknowledgement of his role and contribution. The kind of promotion that could only come from undeniable talent recognized at the highest level. And as the chairman announced the decision, a mixture of awe, respect, and perhaps a twinge of embarrassment rippled across the room, the executives who had doubted him now offering handshakes. Nods of approval, some even murmuring apologies in private to themselves, while Marcus remained calm, absorbing the moment with quiet dignity, understanding that this was not just a personal victory, but a symbolic triumph, a statement to the company that ability, dedication, and intelligence would always be recognized, no matter where it originated. And as he shook hands with Ethan, the silent acknowledgement between them conveyed more than words could, a recognition of potential seen and nurtured, of opportunity given and earned. And Marcus knew in that moment that everything had changed, not just his position, but the perception of him, the narrative of what was possible, the rules of engagement that had long favored titles and appearances, now rewritten by a man who had proved, beyond doubt, that greatness often wore the guise of humility. And when he returned to his new office, the first permanent desk of his career, colleagues paused respectfully as he passed. Some offering smiles that conveyed genuine admiration, others simply quiet acknowledgement. And as he sat down, placing his laptop and notes in order, Marcus finally allowed himself a breath, long, steady, the kind that comes after surviving a storm and realizing that it had been more than just survival. It had been transformation. And he understood that this boardroom revelation was not just about promotion, but about visibility, respect, and the undeniable truth that a mind once tested, once proven, cannot be ignored. And for Marcus, the man who had once studied in the dark under the weight of impossible circumstances, this was not the end of the journey, but the point at which the world had finally begun to notice. 1 year later, the world of Blackwood Industries had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The corporate corridors, once dominated by hierarchy and routine, now buzzing with the stories of talent finally recognized. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Reed, a man whose journey from janitor to executive had become more than a cautionary tale. It had become a legend whispered in meeting rooms, celebrated in internal newsletters, and chronicled quietly by those who had witnessed his transformation firsthand. And the day began like any other, but the press conference held in the main atrium of the building was anything but ordinary, the glass walls flooding the room with sunlight, reflecting off polished marble floors, banners announcing the launch of a new scholarship program, the Reed Initiative, fluttering subtly as photographers clicked their cameras and journalists adjusted microphones, the initiative itself revolutionary in concept. Fully funded, designed to provide education and opportunity for overlooked workers, custodial staff, maintenance crews, night shift employees, and anyone who had been quietly building knowledge in shadows where the world refused to notice. And Marcus stood beside Ethan, the man who had first seen his potential and nurtured it, not as a janitor, not as an intern, but as the newly appointed Director of Strategic Development, the weight of the title balanced by humility. His suit perfectly tailored, tie straight, the confident posture of someone who had finally found a place that matched his ambition and intellect, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes, and microphones poised as the first question came from the front row. A young reporter with wide eyes and pen in hand. "Mr. Reed, what kept you going when the world kept the lights off?" And for a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to remember the nights spent under the dim glow of a battery lamp, textbooks spread across empty offices, formulas and charts scribbled in notebooks, the quiet hum of the building his only company, the whispers of doubt, the assumptions of others, and then he smiled, a faint, knowing curve of lips that carried both experience and triumph. "I learned something early," he said, voice calm but resonant, carrying through the atrium. Capturing the attention of everyone present, darkness doesn't mean you're invisible. Sometimes it just means you're preparing. And those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, not just a reflection of his personal journey, but a philosophy that would now guide hundreds of others through the Reed Initiative. The room silent for a beat as the journalists absorbed the gravity of the statement, the lesson embedded in his tone, in his presence, the authenticity of someone who had lived it. And Ethan looked at him, eyes steady, no trace of pity, no hint of the distance that power often imposes. But with genuine respect, the kind earned through perseverance, insight, and integrity, a silent acknowledgement that Marcus had not only met expectations but had redefined them. And behind them, the building itself seemed to participate in the moment, the fluorescent lights above shining steadily, a symbol now, perhaps unintentional yet undeniable, that every office, every corridor, every floor that had once been darkened by rules, assumptions, and neglect was now illuminated. A metaphor made literal, and as Marcus fielded questions, outlining how the initiative would function, the support structures, the mentorship programs, the funding for tuition, books, and living expenses, he emphasized opportunity, potential, and recognition, words that resonated deeply with an audience increasingly aware of systemic blind spots in corporate culture. And cameras followed as he walked through the atrium, pointing out classrooms, conference rooms, and the newly designed learning hubs where employees could study after shifts without fear or judgment, each explanation punctuated by small anecdotes, examples of individuals he had encountered during his early months at Blackwood, those who, like him, had ambition but no platform, and each story reinforced the central theme. That capability is not always visible, that talent often thrives in unlikely places, and that investment in overlooked people can transform not just lives but organizations. And as the press conference concluded, reporters scrambling to finish quotes, photographers adjusting angles for the final shots, Marcus glanced at Ethan, and in that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition that the work was only beginning, yet the foundation had been laid. Principles established, and the impact would ripple far beyond the walls of the building. And when the journalists departed, the atrium emptying of cameras and microphones, Marcus lingered for a moment, looking around at the offices, the desks, the glass walls, imagining the countless nights when the lights had been off. And for the first time, fully illuminated, he saw not just a building, but a symbol of transformation, opportunity, and acknowledgement, and he realized that the story of his journey, the journey from janitor to executive, from shadow to recognition, was no longer solely his, but belonged to anyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or confined by circumstance. And the Reed Initiative would ensure that no one had to wait in the dark as he had, that education, mentorship, and opportunity would be available to those prepared to work for it, that ambition would be nurtured rather than dismissed. And as he walked back through the atrium, sunlight streaming through the glass, reflecting off polished floors, the fluorescent lights above shining steadily, he knew that every night spent studying by lamp, every silent hour of preparation, every moment of doubt had led to this, the moment when the darkness no longer defined him, when his light was acknowledged, and when the building itself, once indifferent to ambition, now stood as a monument to opportunity, every light staying on, not just as a convenience, but as a promise that no potential would be ignored again.